Good morning, everybody. Another beautiful day on overcast North Atlantic Ocean. And it's incredible to be out here, isn't it? We are literally following in the footsteps, the pathways of the early Scandinavian tribes. In this case, the ones Eric the Red and Leif Erikson and Eric's other sons, Thorvald and Thorstein Erikson. And they were all going back and forth between Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, back to Norway for various things. They were plying back and forth up in here. So it's just so wonderful. On my way here, I stepped outside to get a little fresh air and just looked out there, and you just feel this motion and what it must have been like to be in these ships, these low ships with a low draft, basically no cover. They were really out there with the elements. It's just amazing to think about how they slept and how they ate on those ships, on all those weeks being at sea. A little bit of sway here in the stage today. So, they would dry meat and dry fish and have dried fruits and vegetables and things. So they were able to eat well and get their protein as long as it lasted. And to cover themselves to sleep, they would just they'd be there rowing during their shift, pretty much a 4-hour shift, and then they would they would have a break and they would lay down in between the benches there and put some kind of covering over them. They didn't want to get in sleeping bags because they wanted to be able to get out of the ship if there was a problem, and indeed, too often there were problems. We'll learn that Eric the Red, for instance, took off from Iceland to Greenland with a whole group of 25 to 30 ships, and half of those ships sunk on the way there. So hundreds of people were lost. And literally they're down below us now, the remains of those ships. We're now in between Iceland and, of course, Canada, but Greenland is to the north of us here. I don't think we're going to be able to see the tip of Greenland, but we are literally in those waters right now. So this is a really exciting time to be here and to do this show. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and as you can tell, I could do that pretty much this whole show just on this one here. But let's step back again and take a look at the big picture here, this beautiful planet we're on, hurtling around the sun, 67,000 miles an hour right now we're going. And the sun itself is moving at almost 500,000 miles an hour around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. But I get ahead of myself. I am doing some astronomy tomorrow and Sunday, I believe it is. So got some astronomy coming up for you. That's a major area of interest. So here we are. So most of the peoples that were coming over early were from Norway, which makes perfect sense. They're on the west coast here, the Scandinavian peninsula, if you will. And so they were plying across here. And then they took off from here and came over around here and came up into southern Greenland here, and then also up the coast a little bit here. A lot of the settlements were right in here. And then there were, from there, they would launch off and come down here, and they scanned up and down these coasts here. The famous Leansa Meadow site is right here on the tip of Newfoundland. And there may have been a settlement down here in Nova Scotia at Port Rossi. So this is all familiar territory to these explorers. And right now, of course, we're somewhere in here, and we're going to be coming down here today, tomorrow, and so on. Just magnificent overview there. So chronologically, we have the overview of time, and we're reminded, of course, of all the other activity that was going on simultaneously. The other tribes, Danish tribes, were down primarily here in northern Europe, over into England, Ireland over here, some Scotland. But the Norwegians, the Scandinavians over here were heading east into the Baltic and up some of the rivers there. So it was primarily the Norwegians who were coming over here to Iceland, and then from there on over around to these settlements. So, chronologically, again, let's take a look at this. So we've got the north. The original colonization takes place around the late 800s, the 9th century there. And then Eric the Red's father, Thorvald Arvidsson, is banished from Norway. He was involved with some killings and needed to leave. Wasn't sure if he was banished. All this information, of course, comes out of the sagas. And so the sagas, we have to sort of sort through those and decide what's real and what's embellished and so on. But the word is Eric the Red was a young man. His father was involved in something in Norway here, so they went over to Iceland. And then about 20 years later or so, Eric the Red himself, as a young man, he was involved with some killings in Iceland. And you can read about those in the sagas. And so he was banished by the Althingi, or the chieftains there. They asked him to leave. So he took off, Eric the Red did, and went over here and explored. He was banished for several years. So he went over to Greenland and set up shop and explored all up and down here. And after his time was up, he liked this area, so he came back to Iceland, got a whole bunch of people, and then came back again with a whole bunch of ships. And people, many of them sunk. Some of them, there was like 25 or 30 to start with, and half of them sank. So moving on from 986 to about 1000 CE here, the Vikings continued on down here exploring down along Baffin Island, Labrador, Newfoundland, and so on. So lays out the chronology of events there, keeping in mind that all this other activity was going on with all these other tribes. The Battle of Hastings, for instance, was in 1066 down here. And so there was all this other activity. Rollo had long since really come up the scene and laid siege to Paris and gotten the deal with the King of France to take over Normandy here and set up what we now know as Normandy, based on the Norsemen. And so all this other activity was going on, all these battles and so on. But meanwhile, the Norwegians were up here involved with all this activity. So it's kind of neat to kind of compare all that. A closer look here at some of these early voyages out of the west coast of Norway. And they would come around here, Iceland and so on. And then you have Eric the Red in 985. Over here. And then an interesting guy, Bjarni Herjolfsson, around 985-86. This purple one, he took off on his own, came down here and explored. He was heading for Greenland. He got blown off course, ended up down here along the North Canadian coast, and explored, never set foot on it, but definitely made a note of it and took these observations back to Iceland so that Eric the Red, Leif Erikson later, would be aware that there was other land sighted farther to the west. It's interesting that on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula there, about the furthest western point of Iceland, there's this huge Snæfellsjökull glacier. It's about 5,000, it's about a mile high. And from there, at times, you can see across the Denmark Strait, now it's called, about 175 miles, 280 kilometers, you can actually see Greenland. Or at times it might be an inverted vision of Greenland because of this mirage effect where you have a temperature inversion. So from the top of this volcano in western Iceland, you're actually able to look over at times and see Greenland, amazingly, around the curvature of the earth. So with these stories coming back that there was other land out there, visual observations, potentially there was a push to keep moving west. And moving west they did in these incredible ships, very sturdy ships, very agile in the ocean, shallow draft, able to get up into deltas, up rivers, and so on. They were not real good for fighting the larger European ships in the Mediterranean, but for these kind of situations, they were able to get onto these shallow coves and bays in Iceland and Greenland and over into Canada and retreat as needed quickly. Of course, it's interesting to remember a lot of these other the Scandinavian tribes, they were going down into Europe. They were going to England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, and so on. They were always running into other human beings. They were running into Celtic tribes, peoples, and so they were always butting up against other people. But when they reached Iceland and Greenland, mostly in Greenland especially, there was nobody there. Iceland was up free for the taking. So that must have been a real welcome sight for them to arrive in Iceland. There's nobody here. We don't have to fight anybody for this territory. It must have been very cool. Greenland, actually, they ran into Inuits and Eskimos, Inuits, and various little clans that were already there, or there was evidence of them, so they knew that there was some people around. And certainly when they got down here onto the Labrador Canadian coast down here, they started running into native tribes there. That was one of the questions last night in the Viking trivia contest, was what did they name the natives that they ran into? And it was Skiri. They called the natives the Skiris. So here we go. Again, all of this, everything we know about pretty much is contained in these various sagas. There were all the other sagas that we had looked at before. Snorri Sturluson here, he is credited, we're not entirely sure who wrote them, but it's likely that Snorri Sturluson, who was a chieftain and historian in Iceland, and he's credited with writing these various sagas, which recount all these events. But he's recounting these a couple hundred years after the fact. So this is where we get a lot of the information that we have. Some of it is pretty evident, others has to be ferreted out. This seems to be a more creditable saga here. This one has a little more embellishment and probably some things that are not quite so true. Did anybody go out to Snorri Sturluson's home site there yesterday when you were in Reykjavik? Doesn't sound like it. Okay. So that's still there, a lot to see. So here's Iceland. Here is Isafjordur up in here. Sorry, Edward, for walking away from the podium so much. They need me here. So anyway, here's the west coast of Iceland. Here's the Snæfellsnes Peninsula down here. And this gentleman here, Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, he headed west, and he was looking for anything he could find. He ran into these small islands out here that are now known as Gunnbjornskiris. They're islands between Iceland and Greenland in the early 900s. Early 10th century there. And indeed now the highest point in Greenland, and indeed apparently the Arctic at 12,000 feet, is named Mount Gunnbjorn. So there it is. Here it is. And down on the sort of southwest coast of Greenland. So you get your name engraved on a mountain forever for doing a little exploring. So, after an initial survey, Eric the Red had been banished from Iceland. He went over west. He'd heard about these islands. He'd heard there was possibly other land out there. So he went with a small group of guys, charted it out, lived there for a couple years, came back to Iceland, got 25 ships, 500 people, animals, and so on, around 985. And they headed back over there, over to Greenland. They were going to inhabit Greenland for around 500 years, into the 1400s. And then they mysteriously kind of vanish, these Norse Greenlanders. It's not clear why. I'll talk about that a little more and some possibilities of why all these settlements vanished. Of course, like the Vikings themselves, they assimilated into the local cultures in England and Ireland and Europe. They would intermarry, interbreed, and so on, and they just assimilated into the culture. So that may have happened with the Inuit, but it's believed that a lot of the settlers there in Greenland simply gave up and went back to Iceland and or Norway. So this is an example of some of the beautiful fjords in southern Greenland that Erik the Red and later Leif Erikson and his brothers and sister encountered here in Greenland. Just beautiful. All these fjords, all this had, of course, been carved out some 15 to 20,000 years ago by the receding ice age, which has carved out Maine also. We're going to be heading down to Maine. We are heading down to Maine now. And there's all these peninsulas on the coast of Maine that were carved out similarly by the retreating glaciers. It was like a mile or two of ice down to lower latitudes here. So here's Greenland here, and so we're looking at this box here, and this was a prime area for the settlements. Bradenlid, here's where Erik the Red ultimately set up his camp as a chieftain, and there were all these smaller communities. There's Gardar, and they set up monasteries and churches, and this area was pretty fertile, so they were able to engage in agriculture, raise crops. They had brought sheep and cows, so they really got quite a good livelihood going here. And again, monasteries, that's interesting, the monk monastery, the nun monastery, and all these little communities in here. Some of them are, of course, still there, and if you get on a cruise boat that is going there or just set up excursions, you can go to some of these communities, and there are reconstructions of some of these old Norse houses. Not just reconstructions, but actual ruins, these old rock houses are the remains of them. They are there, and you can go around and see these sites where they actually were. Here's a shot I took several years ago from the air, from an Iceland Air, heading from Iceland back to Dulles Airport. Just magnificent to be able to look down on this area, basically right here. And this is what it looks like from 40,000 feet. And so you can imagine some of these Viking ships coming up in here, and you can see how green these coastlines are. And so Erik the Red found it very suitable. So much so, again, that he went back to Iceland, got a bunch of people, talked it up, and a bunch of them came over. So this whole area here, this box basically is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's dozens and dozens of sites there. The Kuujjuaq region of southwestern Greenland. There was some 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants at its peak there in the, in between about 1,000 to 1,400 AD. And here are some of the names. These are some of the, it's always fun to sort of play around with some of these. These are the Inuit names, and then these are the Norse names. So Erik the Red set up his encampment at this site called Kasirsuk, I would say. And Brattahlid, he named it Brattahlid, which means steep slope. And first church set up there. Another major community, the Inuit name was Igaliku, and that's now Gardar. So if you Google Gardar, for instance, there's a major site there. There's some actual stone ruins there, and some recreations of some of the houses with the turf on the roofs and so on. So Gardar, very popular tourist destination site. And these other sites here, they're not so hard. Sister Lut Oak, and a favorite here, I believe that would be Kakort Tuku Luke. Kakertukaluk, or the Norwegian Valsi. So we'll call it Valsi for short. But it's kind of fun to play around with the other words. This Valsi site is especially prominent also. There's 11 Norse and 2 Inuit or Thule sites there now. And so all this area can be explored. If you've got the money, I'm sure some excursion company has the time. So here's a recreation, for instance, at the Bradelid, Eric the Red's Bradelid site. Replicas of the Viking church and the longhouse, sheep. Must have been pretty nice. People were always looking for more free land. In Iceland, in the early land rush there in the 900s primarily, early to mid 900s, when the original Norse were coming over, the early families there took up most of the choice spots in southern Iceland, which were good for sheep herding and farming. So all the choice spots were taken, and then you get in a little trouble there, and people ask you to leave. So Eric the Red, it was an easy call to say, hey, let's keep going west, see if we can find some more free land. So at the Bradelid site here, there's this wonderful statue, presumably of Eric the Red, looking out over the fjord there, the cove. Doesn't look particularly hospitable or a place where you do a lot of agriculture, but apparently they were able to do some agriculture and keep their animals fed through winter and so on. Here's some more of these the remains of these Norse sites here. Sisurlutok, southwest of the Inuit settlement of Igaliku, and this is the remains of one of the Norse sites. And it's worth keeping in mind that the Norse, we think of them, the Vikings, as these bloodthirsty barbarians, but really, apparently, in reality, according to all the records and the sagas, they were really primarily farmers, hunters, and fishermen. They were just trying to make a living like everybody else. And when things got rough in Norway, they moved west over the oceans. Same with Iceland, moved west, kept looking for a better place or free land and so on. But aside from being, these robbers and pillagers, they were pretty much regular nice guys, I'm sure, if you met them for a beer. So another thing they engaged in Norway and Iceland as well was walrus ivory. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to the British Museum and probably seen the chess pieces, the Lewis chess pieces from Greenland, which are now in the British Museum. We saw them a few days ago. And these are believed to be, have been carved from walrus ivory tusks in Greenland. And so the Greenland communities, the Iceland communities, they both were in contact and trading with Norway, back home Norway, down into Europe. And so there was a fair amount of activity still going on between them. Here's a look at the Gardar I was mentioning, the Igaliku Inuit site. It was near there. And here are remains of the bishop's barn. There was a bishopric there. Lutherans, most of them. Looks like a beautiful place to live and fish and hunt and so on. Must have been long, cold winters, of course. Cold, dark winters. Igaliku, here's the, looking down in the area where the Inuit, near Gardar. Beautiful territory. Beautiful landscape. So apparently, these groups butted up against each other as these migrating groups do. Migrations, they come into other territory where people are. There was some Inuits. So they would exchange information and trade some products and things, weapons, tools, clothing, how to do things, and so on. So it's always an interesting study, sociological study, and how these groups interacted and what they all got out of meeting each other. Sometimes it wasn't so good, of course. More ruins in this Gardar area. There's quite a few artifacts have been recovered, and there's no doubt still many there. So you have all these utensils and various bowls and cups and spoons and so on. Very cool. So here's the aerial view of the Valsey ruins, feasting hall here. Look at that, how close to the water they are. Incredible. Just to look at these sites and see the remains of where these hardy human beings lived and probably danced and played and fought and ate and drank and all the stuff that we do. And it all went on here, and now there's just sort of the spirits or ghosts left of them, whatever. And so again, the Greenlandic communities lasted until the 1400s here, the early 15th century. That date there, it's recorded in the sagas that Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir were married at this church. It was the last recorded event of Viking Scandinavians in Greenland. What happened to them, again, remains a mystery, but there are researchers that have proposed a number of thoughts about it. There were other sites aside from this lower southern tip of Greenland here. Some of them went up around the west coast here, which was also very fertile. And so there were all these little communities in these little fjords up in here as well, just to make note of that. And then also later, 1700s here, well after the Viking Age. But it's interesting that descendants of Vikings, the Norwegians, Danish, here's this gentleman, the missionary, Hans Egede, and there's a statue to him over Nuuk, Greenland, there, which is the biggest city on the west coast of Greenland, about up in here, I would say, Nuuk. And he's got a very interesting story there. He came from Norway. He had this vision to Christianize Greenland, which apparently had already been attempted earlier on by Erik the Red and Leif Erikson. But then when they disappeared in the 1400s, then by the 1700s, people in Norway were still, kind of wondering, well, where did everybody go? Some of them probably came back. Some went to Iceland. Maybe some went to Europe. Many died. There was an interest in going back to Greenland and looking for descendants of these earlier peoples. Apparently, Hans Egede did not find any direct descendants, but he set up a missionary and attempted to bring some more civilization, law and order, so to speak, and certainly Christianity. And just like a lot of the Norwegian kings of earlier years, he would either do that with the nice words that he would offer, and if the people didn't accept that, he would resort to violence to get people to give up their old pagan ways and accept the new Christian ways. And just like in Iceland, they would come to some agreements and say, well, everybody's going to get baptized, but you can keep doing your little pagan rituals on the side in private, and we'll all get along. And that was pretty much the agreement that was struck in Iceland and in Greenland and a lot of places across Europe. It was these tacit agreements. So interesting guy to study there. It's kind of sad. There's some tragedy there. He brought in some people from Norway, and they had smallpox. And smallpox spread, so hundreds of people died. So he had a mixed bag of his success of bringing order and peace and health to the area because there was illness and epidemic. So, pause. Let us pause a moment. Bjarni Herjolfsson sailed west from Greenland. We're backing up a little from the earlier Greenland explorations, and now we're going to take a look at moving on from Greenland over onto the west coast of what became Canada and down to Nova Scotia, primarily the Newfoundland. So this guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson, he sighted North America around 1000 BC. Some years later, Leif Erikson hears about this. Leif Erikson being, of course, one of Erik the Red's 3 sons. He buys Bjarni's boat and hears about the land he had sighted, and he headed west to the coast. And presumably this is an illustration of good old Leif Erikson, who's the big statue in front of the church there in Reykjavik, of course. So, good map here. Maps are always good to kind of establish what we've got. So you have these various, here's Bjarni's route. He came over here to Iceland. He had heard his father went to Greenland. He tried to go to Greenland but was blown off course. Ended up down here off the coast of Newfoundland and explored up along the Newfoundland, Labrador, up to Baffin Island here, and then came back around, came back to Greenland, finally found it, told everybody here that he had sighted all these lands over here, so that it put the idea into Leif Erikson's head to continue the journey. So he bought his boat some years later and hired a crew out of Greenland, and they went down along the coast again. And so you can see Leif Erikson's journey here. So, taking a closer look here at Newfoundland and this famous site now, the Lion Meadows site up here. And that is believed to be where Leif Erikson set up camp for a couple of years, interacted with some of the local natives with varying degrees of success. So that site is also a huge tourist mecca, really, for people interested in the Viking era. So this couple out of Norway, interesting, colorful couple, Helge Marcus Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad. They were very interested in finding Norse settlements in the New World, and so they came over here and hired a crew, and they started doing archaeological excavations, and they started finding various remains of dwellings and tools and things like that. And today they've restored a lot of it here, and they're very interesting, outspoken couple, fun to research. And yeah, in 2021, they actually ran carbon-14 dating on some of the wood there and got a very, very firm date of around 1021 CE AD for this site. So it definitely dovetails very nicely with Leif Erikson's expeditions, and his brothers came down there also after him and used the same site. Here's a recreation of what this site may look like. It may have looked like back then, able to pull those boats up, those shallow draft boats, and set up these long houses, tide coming in and out. Must have been an amazing time. No communication, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no refrigeration, except the natural. Living in houses like this, they would go out and dig up the turf and pile it on top of the whatever structures they could build, stone structures, wood structures, and good for insulation if you need it. So there at Leon Meadows, there's this beautiful sculpture of these Vikings looking out in all directions. This is what they see from that site, looking out. There on the north tip of Newfoundland. So that lasted for several years, and then they went back also. They went probably back to Greenland and then Iceland, maybe some to Norway, but they abandoned this site, and but it's been recreated, able to go there. So this gentleman here, Dr. Thomas McGovern, he's with the City University of New York, Department of Anthropology. He has spent some 40 years researching Greenland, Iceland, the Faroes, Shetlands, and he's come up with multiple reasons for how the Norse adapted to these harsh environments and why they ultimately disappeared, went extinct. And this is basically a list. The climate was cooling. It got colder. Competition with African ivory meant that one of their main sources of income, providing ivory back to Europe, was lost. So that trade was apparently lost. Soil depletion. Apparently, the animals, the sheep, actually dug, as they were eating whatever soil there was, grass there was there, they would actually eat the roots of the grass, and so the grass wouldn't continue to grow. So soil depletion, vegetation depletion, trade routes were changing, so they were being bypassed there in Greenland. Apparently, there was some unwillingness to adopt to the Inuit practices, which reminds me of our polar explorers like John Franklin. That was one of the causes of their demise, is they wouldn't really rely on the Inuit ways of doing things that might have helped them survive. And so these are some of the major reasons that Dr. McGovern gives for the disappearance of the Vikings from the Norse from Greenland. There's been other good books written on this. Westward Vikings, the Saga of Leon Meadows by Birgitta Wallace here. Very thorough, well-documented study. She's, I believe, a professor of anthropology up in Canada also. So further research there. This is a very fascinating book, The Last Imaginary Place, A Human History of the Arctic World by Robert McGee. And again, I strongly recommend this book here, Robert Ferguson's. It's an incredibly concise overview, but detailed as well. Concise but detailed overview of the entire Viking Age as we know it. And we're about to close out this whole series I've offered on this cruise on the Vikings, the Scandinavian tribes. This pretty much wraps this up. We'll be moving on tomorrow. I'll be looking at Maine, the state of Maine, and into New England, native tribes there, the early European explorations by the Dutch, the English, and the French into New England. In anticipation of arriving at Bar Harbor. And then the next day, we're just going to be knocking them out, all these sea days here, because that's pretty much it before we get down into New England. So we'll be doing Maine and then Boston, which will give some of you Brits a great view of the American side of the Revolution. And we can compare notes and anyway, it's interesting, and I'm sure that there's room for discussion there. And then finally, New York City. I'll be looking at the American Revolution and up to the present time in New York City as well. So that's it for the Vikings here. Very cool that a few years ago was considered the age of the millennium of the Vikings, and according to the sagas, and so on. Leif Erikson arrived 1,000 years ago. So it was very cool that the governments of Iceland, Scandinavia, Greenland, America, Canada, and so on, all got together and had all these various events and commemorations, histories of this era. So there's plenty of research material out there on Google. So again, we are finishing up the Vikings in Greenland here. Today, July 4th. Happy birthday, America, by the way. And good luck. I hope we make it another 100 and whatever years we as a democracy. So tomorrow we'll look at Maine geologic, cultural history, Boston, down to New York, so the next few days. And it sounds like they've added a couple shows. Those of you that may have seen the Polar Exploration in the Explorers Lounge, they're adding a couple shows that I have on astronomy. And so look at the great universe, galaxies, and seen through the eyes of the Hubble Space Telescope, James Webb Telescope, and so on. So that's pretty much it for today. Thank you for coming out, and